all common. Everybody goes through this. Everybody feels this sadness. And there's something about us feeling that sadness together that helps us not feel so sad after all, because everybody feels it. It's the age-old point that if the whole world was blind, seeing would mean nothing, because nobody would know what they're missing. But if everybody is miserable, then happiness is just this ephemeral thing that people are really seeking in vain. But I want to let you know that there are different kinds of happiness. Natural happiness is the happiness that we receive when we achieve something that we've sought to accomplish. So let's say we said, I want to get an A in economics. Well, you accomplish that, you feel happy. That's what's called natural happiness. When you're playing a basketball game and you're like, man, we need to come back from losing by 10 points to win the game. Then you actually come back and you win the game. You feel happy. You want to go win a championship in hockey, or you want to be able to road trip from New York to California with your best friends, and you guys arrive. That produces what we call natural happiness. But for a lot of us, while happiness is something that really fits into this category, we just want to accomplish certain things. What happens when we get what we want? But what we're going to learn tonight is that getting what we want is not the only essential element to happiness. Natural happiness actually does not produce as much happiness as we think. So I want to kind of step a little bit on Freud's toes and recognize the fact that the pursuit of happiness is a non-negotiable for human beings. Everybody wants to be happy. It is innate in us genetically. It is innate in us biologically. It is innate in us psychologically. We want to be happy. Even people who are grappling with suicide, or people who are cutting themselves, or engaging in certain kinds of self-inflicting behavior, it's because they want to reduce the pain and the misery that they feel. People want to be happy. They want to reduce the misery of life. This is an innate desire. You can't shake the desire for happiness. You can decide you don't want to pursue your PhD. You can decide, you know what, I'm not going to go to that university. But you cannot make the decision and make your biology and your intellect agree that I'm just not going to be happy. You may accept that you are not happy, but you will never stop desiring to be happy. If you go to Amazon.com, you're going to find 2,000 books on the subject of happiness. 20 ways to do this, 10 habits to be happy, 20 different things to do in your life to make sure you die happy. 2,000 books. If you look even in the pharmaceutical industry, 120 million prescriptions of antidepressants. You can't tell me that people don't want to be happy. Number one, you got 2,000 books that are written and people are all buying them somewhere in the world. Then you have 120 million prescriptions. Listen, there's only 360 million people in America. So now if you're talking about 120 million prescriptions of antidepressants, we're getting into a situation now where it is very clear that people are becoming less happy, even though income has increased, almost tripled, just from a couple generations ago. Also keep in mind that the drug business in 1995 was a $400 billion industry. This was actually 8% of world business was actually illegal drugs. That's equal to gasoline and oil in terms of the proportion of what they do to the global economy. Clearly, these are different avenues by which people are pursuing happiness because people want to be happy. This is why they use drugs. This is how addictions begin. And I don't have time to break down that science. In fact, this is the first time in the world where more people are dying by suicide than by homicide. More people die from suicide than from murder. So as much as we say Chirac and we talk about all the homicides happening in Chicago, more people die by suicide than by homicide. So the pursuit of happiness is a non-negotiable. So don't try to get off the hook and say, hey, you know what, I don't have to worry about being happy. That is actually not the case. Let me share the first thing that I want to talk to you about happiness is the power of smiling. It's very interesting when you think about smiling is that if you smile at someone, it's very hard for them not to smile because there's a mimic mechanism in our brains. There's mirror neurons that in order for us to understand whether a smile is genuine or fake, we actually have to smile ourselves. It's very interesting. They did an experiment where they took students and they said, you have to hold this pencil in your mouth. And they showed them pictures of people smiling and they said, is this a genuine smile or is this a false smile? And you'd be shocked to know that with the pencil in their mouth, they could not tell the difference because they couldn't mimic the smile. But as soon as they removed the pencil, they grew in accuracy by almost 95%. Because in order for me to understand whether something is genuine or not in terms of a smile, I have to smile myself. So guess what? If you want to make other people smile, start smiling. It will literally make them smile. I used to teach sales in the summertime, and I remember going to door with this Korean young man, and he was like, people don't buy books. I'm not a good salesperson. This is not working. So I went to work with him at one particular door. And as I was at the door with him, the woman came and she said, I'm sorry, I'm so busy. I have some food in the oven. I just kept smiling. I said, ma'am, it's no problem. We just want you to take a quick look at what we're doing. Blah, 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 blah. I said, it's only $10. If you want to help us, that would be great. And I just gave a big smile at the end. Colgate smile. The woman looked. She said, sure, no problem. Let me go get $10. And she came back out, bought the book, and she said, you have a really nice smile. Then I looked at him. I said, it works. You need to smile more. He was just too serious. One of the funny things is that kids smile 400 times a day. Think about that. 400 times a day. Now, let me tell you the power of one smile. Do you know that one smile can actually have the same effect on the brain as 2,000 chocolate bars? I want you to think about this. One smile can. We're not talking about a little casual smile, a little smirk, half the cheek. We're talking about the raising of the corner of the lips. We're talking about the curling on the sides of the eyes. That kind of smile can have the effect on the brain as if you just ate 2,000 chocolate bars. I mean, you might be in a stupor, right? If you ate 2,000 chocolate bars. One smile can also have the same effect as if someone handed you $25,000 for free. Now you're sitting here at the University of Michigan, you're like, oh Lord, my books, my tuition is so expensive. Someone walks up and hands you $25,000. That same impact that is going to have on your brain can equal the impact of one smile. So you imagine, right? That means you're talking about if you think about this, $25,000 for one smile, and kids smile 400 times a day. You can only imagine why kids run around and feeling like they're Mark Zuckerberg, because they're extremely, extremely happy. Another thing I want to mention about happiness is that happiness is not something that can be found. People never achieve happiness by seeking for it. Everyone always gets happiness from something else that's happening. And this is a very, very important point that eludes so many different people. When they're talking about, I'm just not happy. But happiness is not something you can go and buy for 12 ounces on the shelf. Happiness is not something you can find in the freezer section and just say, I need 3 frozen packs of happiness. Happiness is not something you can inject in your veins. Whenever people experience happiness, and we're talking about the pleasure side of the brain, not the reward side of the brain. We have to separate these two things. They used to think psychologically that in the brain, the reward system, right, from what we talked about on Tuesday, the VTA part of the brain, below the cognitive thinking, below the emotional part of the brain, at the very core of the brain where dopamine is managed, this is a very centralized chemical. Dopamine is not released throughout the brain, it's concentrated in one area. But oxytocin, when you're dealing with the pleasure, we're talking about I like something, like pizza, like you can smell the pizza in this room right now. When you're enjoying that, this may release a certain level of oxytocin, and that's evenly distributed throughout the brain. So when we're talking about happiness being found, we're not talking about wanting something in motivation. We're talking about pleasure and enjoyment. And it's always going to require some other external object to achieve. You're not going to be happy simply by saying, well, I'm looking for happiness. Well, what exactly are you looking for? It's like saying, I don't want to look at a beautiful flower. I don't want to look at a beautiful woman. I don't want to look at a beautiful sunset. I want to see beauty itself. Where are you going to go to find beauty itself? You can only find things that are beautiful, that are full of beauty. But you're not going to find beauty in its own pure essence. You're only going to find it expressed in thousands of different ways. And happiness is no different. It's not going to come just from one thing. It's not going to come just from one moment of life. It's not going to come just from one experience. It's going to be an aggregation of experiences, the sum total. Another thing that's important to know about happiness is that happiness is not the absence of misery, right? We're not talking about a continuum. Okay, here's unhappiness, point A. How do I get to happiness, point B? And that means that those of us who are control freaks, those of us who are kind of risk averse, and we think as long as I remove all danger from my life, as long as I remove every possibility of something that can go wrong, I will be happy. That is a part of the equation, but that is not the full picture. We do not believe that the reduction of misery automatically leads to happiness. If that were the case, then you could easily say that those who have the most material things that are satisfied would be the happiest people, but that's actually not the case. The wealthier people become, the more likely they are to commit suicide. Now that doesn't make any sense. But there's no question that the reduction in material goods definitely reduces happiness, without question. You lose your car, you lose your house, you will be unhappy. It's going to reduce your happiness. But saying, oh, let's get that 5-bedroom house instead of that 3-bedroom house, those do not correlate. It does not automatically translate that happiness is going to be achieved, because happiness is not just the removal of pain. It is not just the removal of misery. It is not just the reduction of discomfort. It is actually something more, completely different categorically, how it works. Let me also move on to this point, that happiness is not synonymous with freedom. You know, we are familiar with this if we've ever heard of, the research that's been done on the paradox of choice, right? In this research, which is a very fascinating stuff, because we live in a time where we think about choices, right? People look at universities and they choose, well, do they have your major? Do they not have your major? Even though most students change their major like 5 times when they're in university. But nevertheless, they're going to look at this and say, look at all the different things that you can study at this university. But the reality is, this is why college students are confused. Is because they have so many options, as the research suggests. And not only do you become confused, you actually become less satisfied. There's a research study based on a theoretical framework called the free choice paradigm. This is an interesting study because they started off with people, they bring them in a room, and they would basically give them 6 Monet pictures. And so they would rank them. They said, I want you to rank the 6 Monet pictures in order of what you like the most and the ones you like the least, 1 to 6. So they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they rank them. Then they come back and they say, hey, you know what? We ended up having some extra prints in the office. We only have number 3 and number 4. So which one would you like to take home? And so people contemplate, and the irony is most of them choose number 3 because they ranked it as higher than number 4. So then they take number 3, then they go home, and they're looking at the picture, and they're trying to see how satisfied are they with this particular Monet picture. So then they notice that people, even though they thought that, oh, they probably won't be happy because they didn't get number 1, when they came back the next time and they said, okay, here's the 6 Monet pictures. We want you to rank them, the one you like the most to the one that you like the least. And now the one that they took home ended up number 1. And then they re-ranked all the rest of them after this. And so they said, well, maybe that's because of bias, right? So then they tried it on people that have amnesia, people who literally can't remember. So they basically have them do the same experiment, rank the 6 Monets. Okay, we only have 3 and 4. Which one would you like? They took home the Monet. They left the office, sat in the hallway for 30 minutes because they literally couldn't remember if you came back in the room. And so after they came back in 30 minutes, they entered back in the room and they said, hey, and the person said, hey, doc, you know I have amnesia. I might have met you before, but I won't remember that, etc. They said, it's cool. We just want you to rank these. And the irony was, even people who have amnesia, who can't even remember that they own the picture, choose the one that they actually own as the first that they like the most in the second time they do the test. They even tried to take this to the next level, and they went to Harvard University. And they said, let's really test this free choice thing. So they went to Harvard and they said, we're going to do a photography class, give you some cameras, teach you how to shoot, use a black room, all these different things. And then they told them, we want you to take pictures of your favorite things on campus. So they took pictures of professors and dorms and, epic scenes of homeless people there in Harvard Yard. And I used to live in Cambridge and worked out there for a while. And so it's a very nice place. There's a lot going on in Harvard Square. And so as they took all these photos, they came back in and they showed them and said, hey, which ones do you really like? And then they showed them how to use the black room and to blow it up and make these big, glossy black and white pictures. and they said, hey, so these are the two that you like? They said, yeah, these are the two that I like. Say, hey, man, the problem is you can't keep both pictures. You have to choose one. We got to send one back to England. It's going to be literally leaving in like 2 minutes, so I need you to hurry up and make a choice. So the students who are like, I'll just take this one, took it home, framed it, they kept it in their room. Then they had another student group where they said, hey, we actually going to maintain the second one for 3 or 4 days, so if you decide that maybe you like this one instead of that one, you can come back and switch it. So the irony was, they made their choice, but even though it was there for 3 or 4 days, these students were so conflicted and dissatisfied. Should I have chosen that one? Should I have chosen my professor? Should I have chosen the one in Harvard Square because that one was really inspirational? Should I have chosen this one? And then even after they make their choice, the 3-4 days is gone, they had 66% of them have less satisfaction with the end choice, simply because they had more freedom, because they could have chosen. But the very fact that the other ones were stuck, they were more likely to be happy with what they had. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later in the presentation. Freedom is not synonymous with happiness. Do not assume because you have more options, you will be a happier person. And there's one more proof I have to give to this point. When you think about vacations, you think about people going overseas, and I travel quite a bit. It's very interesting how people like to go to these rustic, simple living conditions, right, in order to relax and unplug from the modern life that we live, right? The internet and texting and cell phones and computers and all these different things. And where do they want to go? They want to go out there in the rural villages of Africa and India. They want to go out to the rural parts of Indonesia near Bali and just, you have to wash your clothes in the creek like the rest of the women, beat the clothing on the rock all day afternoon, come back through the market, carry it on your head. As you're walking back through, you grab this thing of bananas. Everything that you do, that you buy, is always negotiation back and forth. No, how about, 50 rupees? No, 40 rupees. How about 35 rupees? Okay, how about this? It's like, no way. I can't go lower than 20. Okay, I can't help you. Okay, 19 rupees. Okay, now you're there doing the negotiation. You go back and we're like, man, life is so simple. You can't go to Walmart and be like, hey, how about that MacBook? 800. It's $1,200. How about 950? It's $1,200. So if you're not going to pay $1,200, you're not going to get it. But yet these people in this lifestyle, we go there to relax. And we feel happier when we don't have as much demand upon us. Happiness is not synonymous with freedom. The time is up. And I want to pause here as we go to get some pizza, get some soda, and we'll continue with the rest of the points in the next part of our presentation. So, David, it's your time.
All right. So we're going to pause now for the next 10 to 15 minutes. So let's say 7:45. So give you guys some time to go get some pizza, get a drink, and then
All right. We're going to be restarting again to pick back up where we left off. Now, for those of you, again, who have not participated with us hitherto throughout the week, just to make you aware of exactly where we're going, one of the big things that I also bring to my presentations is, in this particular context, is to incorporate some elements that I also derive even from faith on the particular topic. So I will be referencing some religious texts as well as we go forward in the second half of the presentation, just so that I can also speak to that side of the human experience, as well as the broadness of what these topics really encompass. And I believe that a lot of times, because religion has been edged out of the conversation, there are some different insights that are missing from these conversations as to possible explanations and alternative viewpoints. So we left off talking about how happiness is not synonymous with freedom. Right? Just pursuing something that you feel is going to give you more options does not necessarily increase your potential and even your resulting happiness. And so let me go forward into talking about happiness is found in flow. This is actually very, very new and cutting-edge research. This is one of my favorite football players, Lionel Messi. In my opinion, he's the best, but since I have the podium, I can say that. You can talk to me about it afterwards. But in the concept of flow, the concept of flow is this ancient Greek concept where we derive the word ecstasy, right? It's the concept of being ecstatic. And I remember when I wasn't having, but my wife was birthing our first child. I was just there assisting and supporting. When we were there in the hospital room at University of Michigan Hospital, actually, when my daughter was being born, I recall, the nurses were there, the doctor, and it got real crazy because you saw the head, right? So then they start, everyone just starts going crazy up in there. People came out of doors you didn't know were doors. And then next thing you know, push, 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 right? My wife is yelling at me, I'm pushing. And so I'm finally going through this whole experience, and I'm thinking, I have no clue what I'm going to feel once this child comes out. I did not expect what I experienced the moment that my daughter literally left the birth canal. And so the only way for me to describe it is that as she came out, right, I'm holding my daughter, right, she has the umbilical cord still attached and everything, and I immediately started crying and laughing at the same time. I mean, it was a crazy experience. I've never had this experience before in my entire life. And there was no preparation, there was no anticipation that could have told me, Sebastian, this is what you're going to feel when you have a child. And as I was holding my daughter, I'm crying and laughing. And I remember talking to my friend who's very well researched in sociology and those kind of things. And he said, Sebastian, you were experiencing this concept of ecstasy, right? Where literally you had all these different emotions conflicting upon you at the same time, right? You were crying, but you were also laughing. And it was just the overwhelming of this emotion of the moment. And in this concept of ecstasy, it's the concept that you are literally beside the situation. So when you were in a point of being in ecstasy, it was like you were outside of the circumstances and you were sitting beside it, observing it. And that's exactly how it felt. It felt like I was in the room, I was observing everything that was happening, but I was literally experiencing something that was almost like out of body. Like I was watching everything, it was slowing down. I could see people's facial expressions, I could smell something, I could feel things, but at the same token, I was reacting and acting in a different part of my being. And in this issue of flow, people say that individuals who are absorbed in, for example, something like active in sports, where you have high challenge and high skill, you can get so absorbed in what you are doing that you literally forget your identity. You literally forget your environment. You literally forget the circumstances or how much money you have in the bank account or who dumped you last week. When you're literally absorbed in the flow, is what they call it in research, you are literally in a state of ecstasy. Happiness typically results in flow. And they say, man, this guy lost his house. This girl basically was dumped, rejected by her family. And yet when she's out there playing soccer, yet when she's there singing, it's almost as if she's lifted above. the entire problems that she's experiencing. And this is how the very fact that when we look at the celebrities of life and we see the story behind the story, right? This is the celebrity, they're smiling and they're popular, but we get the inside story. We're thinking, how can that person get on stage? How can that guy go into that basketball game? How can that professor stand up and still give the kind of lectures they give with all the stuff that's going behind them? Because they're stepping into flow. And when they're in that moment of flow where they're experiencing high challenge and high demand, and yet there is high skill matching that challenge, they find themselves in a complete state of ecstasy. They literally receive happiness and experience it in that time. And so the better that we can maximize the flows of life, for these things to be innate and intrinsic to our schedules, we will discover even more happiness than what we've had before. Happiness being in flow is just something that I cannot emphasize this particular point enough. People oftentimes enjoy the things that they are excellent at. If we focus on the areas where we have lots of skill and we challenge ourselves in those areas, you are going to find an enormous amount of happiness. The research tells us that this is so. Now, I want to talk to you about the fact that happiness can be bought. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, right, that you can't buy happiness. People have probably said that. This is a text from the author, gospel writer Luke, who also wrote the book of Acts in the Bible in the New Testament, and he's quoting a particular statement that Paul made, and this is the statement that he made. He says, "You must support the weak, and remember the words of the Lord Jesus that he said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.'" Now, people thought this is just a nice little saying, but research found otherwise. There were some Harvard business students that read an article, right, and they were saying to themselves, hey, listen, we read this article and it says these people were winning the lottery, and yet they were reading about how a year after they won the lottery, hundreds of millions of dollars, their lives were literally ruined. I mean, they went into debt, they lost all their relationships, all of a sudden everybody they knew and all their friends were coming and asking them for money. And so they're saying, well, maybe having a lot of money wasn't going to provide the happiness that they wanted. But what they found deeper in the research was that these people, when they won the lottery, they spent all the money on themselves. Oh, I'm going to get me a new house. I'm going to get me a new car. I'm going to go buy this. I'm going to get a private jet. I'm going to go get a house in Monaco. And then I'm going to be over here on the beach in Palm Springs. And then I'm going to be... So they thought that, oh, you know what? Let's try this experiment. So they went... Two students on campus at the University of in British Columbia. And they went out there and they said, hey, we're going to give you an envelope. It had $5 or $20. And half of the group, they said, hey, take this money, spend it on yourself. The other half, they say, we want you to use the money to do something for someone else. Spend it on someone else. And the funny thing was that most of these college students, they bought Starbucks. Right? They were like, clearly Starbucks is associated with generosity and giving. People see money, students see money, they see Starbucks. So the students who bought the money on themselves, a lot of them went to Starbucks, bought themselves a coffee, chilled out, hey, caramel macchiato, whatever it is, down this thing. And then the other students went and bought someone else Starbucks with the same money. But what they found was the students who bought someone else the Starbucks, their level of happiness from before they gave them the envelope, and the level of happiness afterwards when they spent the money and they called them at the end of the day, the ones who spent the money on someone else were actually happier. But they said, hey, people in British Columbia, they're pretty wealthy. Maybe that's why it works. So then they went to Uganda. And when they went to the country of Uganda, they did the same thing, only in their currency. They said, hey, here's 5 in your currency, 20 in your currency. And again, they told them the same thing. Spend it on yourself. The other group, spend it on someone else. And then, again, they saw the same result. Here they were, and $5 in their currency isn't as much as $5 American. But yet and still, the same resulting happiness came out of it. So then they looked at the Gallup poll to find out that what were the countries in the world and the communities that were spending money on charities. So then they went out again, and as they did the same exact thing, they said, wow, the whole world was lit up, except for the Democratic Republic of Congo was the only country that was not lit up as saying people were happier because they were giving. Nobody knows why that is the case, but for some reason, that's just what the data says. But the rest of the world, Europe, America, Every other part of Africa, Rwanda, which is right next to DRC, same thing. Completely green. These people experience lots of happiness from giving. But you know, when they were going through this whole experience, they said, well, let's try it for a pharmaceutical company. So I used to work for a dermatologist. And so every single time if you're a medical doctor, you own your own practice, you always get these pharmaceutical salespeople that come to the office, right, bring you a little sample. Hey, try these out. Let us know what you think, and blah, blah. They're always trying to sell the doctor on something. So they had two pharmaceutical teams. The first team, they said, hey, guys, we're going to give you, everybody in the group, $20, $50. You spend it on yourself. The other group, $20, $50, spend it on someone else in your group. What they discovered was the people who spent the money on themselves, hey, you know, I'm going to go here, get myself a nice lunch, go to Olive Garden, right? The other people, they spend it on somebody else in the group. They actually found that the group that spent the money on each other rather than themselves, their sales went up. So they said, guess what? You got actual more return on your money than if you just give bonuses to your top sales guy and you say, hey, man, you make your sales marks, we're going to give you an extra $1,000. Yeah, he might spend it on himself, but that's not necessarily going to increase his productivity. But if you look at the data on the other side, you spent this money and said, hey, spend it on each other. This is money I'm giving you to buy each other different things. Their sales went up almost 50% in some groups. But then they said, okay, maybe that context is not satisfying enough. So they went to dodgeball teams, right? Intramural dodgeball. And they said, hey, you're a dodgeball team, et cetera, et cetera. Same proposition. Spend it on yourself, spend it on these other people, and guess what? Every single team that spent the money on each other, they either grew from being the top of the intramural league or the very best, and they went up in the top 3. It works in personal life, it worked in a professional context, it worked even in intramural sports. And through this study, they said, guess what? You can actually buy happiness. Not by necessarily buying a thing, but on what you spend that money upon. It's called pro-social spending instead of anti-social spending. So if we get a whole bunch of money and we say, but the purpose of this is for me to do this for this person, this for this person, that for that person, you're actually going to achieve way greater happiness. And guess what? You don't have to be a billionaire to experience that kind of happiness. Even if you just have $5 extra on campus, instead of going and say, I'm going to go get my favorite piece of cake from the Cheesecake Factory, take someone else to get the cheesecake. You'll actually get more happiness than if you just enjoyed the cheesecake yourself. But I know some girl is saying, but if it's chocolate, that may not work. So who knows the case? So we find that these words that Paul is quoting, that it is indeed more blessed. The word blessed is simply biblical language for happiness. You are more happy. He says, listen, you're a happier person to give than to receive. That is a now scientific fact based on the research. Another critical point is happiness exists more in we than in me. You know, they did a textual analysis of all the different suicide people who committed suicide in either their verbal postings on YouTube or actual letters that they wrote. And when you do a textual analysis, this is a big thing we do in communications where we analyze the text and we say, how many times, you know, are certain words used? In what context are they used? What's the repetition level? What's the flow at the beginning, at the end, in the middle, when they're making a point, et cetera, et cetera. What they found was in these particular notes or statements by those who committed suicide, there was a huge increase, right, of the use of the first person pronoun, singular. I, me, there was never a we, there was never an us, there was never any of these things. And they realized from the research that people who are literally attempting suicide, it is not so much a hopeless situation as it is a loneliness one. A lot of times, if you look at the young girl that killed herself in Canada because the young man was because an older man was bullying her with pictures of herself. And I don't know if you recall this, but she posted a YouTube video where it was silent, where she held up cards throughout the YouTube video. You should actually YouTube this when you get home. As she's going through it, she tells you, literally detailing for a 20-minute YouTube video, everything the guy did to her. Right? He tricked her into thinking that he was actually a teenager, but he was a grown man. Then she sent a picture of herself. He took the picture, ruined her life, sent it to all her friends at school. Then he said, if you don't send me more pictures, if you don't meet up with me. So then her parents got scared. She finally told them they moved school. Then he found her again. Then all the people that she thought were her best friends, who said they had her support, come to find out they were also tricking her into taking pictures and sending it to other people and posting it online. And by the end of the YouTube video, she says, because right after this, she literally commits suicide at 17 years old. And she says in one of her last cards, I just wanted someone to be my friend. You cannot watch that video and think to yourself, I would have been your friend. You look at that video and you're thinking, if that girl was still alive, if I had known that this 17-year-old girl was going through this in Canada, I would have been your friend. Because it wasn't so much an issue that she was unhappy because of what she went through, because of all the problems, as much as it was that she was alone. There was no one that she could depend upon. And this point is so much more poignant because the longest running research study, which was done out of Harvard, it is called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. They've been studying these guys for 75 years. Can you imagine? The guy who was presenting this research, he's the fourth director of the research project. And out of the 724 young men that they started with, only 60 of them are still alive. And now they're studying the 2,000 children that they've had. I mean, this is like 75-year study. This is what they did. They took two groups in Boston. They took sophomores at Harvard University. Then they also took a group of young men from the poorest parts of Boston. I mean, these guys were in a bad situation. And so they said, look, we want to take these guys, we want to watch them grow up and go through life. And as they're looking at adult development, they kept asking the question, what does it mean to live a good life? And what they found after 75 years of research on 724 men, it didn't matter your economic status. It didn't matter about where you went to school. He grew up in, some became factory workers. One of the people they researched became the president of the United States of America. And they said none of these things mattered. What always mattered and made the difference was that did they have quality relationships? They looked on a picture and they said, who can you predict who's going to live the longest at 50 years old? And the greatest predictor was how satisfied were they in their marriage? Did they think that even if they were fighting with their wife or their husband, even if they were going through all this stuff, they said, did they feel like their spouse was going to be there for them in the difficult times? And if they felt like I could depend upon my wife in the difficult times, they would literally live longer than the men who felt like they couldn't trust their wives, that they couldn't lean upon them in a difficult time. Because happiness is not so much about the me. It exists more in the we. If we want happiness, we must, and listen, 75 years of research through several different generations of research groups. We're talking from the 1930s. These people were literally in college and went off to World War II. And only 60 are still alive. The testimony of the data cannot be denied. If you want to live a happier and healthier life, you must have good quality relationships. And not only does it protect their body, it actually protects even their brain. And what they discovered was the exact opposite was true. Loneliness kills. Loneliness kills. So getting more money doesn't necessarily increase your happiness until you look at what you're spending it upon. And as you spend it upon other people, you're going to discover that your relationships will become more meaningful. The Bible uses the phrase, how happy are the undefiled in the way, who walk in the law of the Lord. And Mark says, and the second is like it. It is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. He says, when we look at the 10 Commandments, when we look at the law, when we look at the Bible and these religious teachings, they all hang upon this principle, loving others, the engagement in the other, the interest in the other. And as we engage in that, he says, how happy are those people who walk in that path, who walk in that law where they say the rule of my life is to always consider others. And relationships is what makes people the happiest. My last point for tonight is based on a research study where they took a lottery winner of $314 million. They said, I want you to make a prediction, right? You guys can practice this tonight. I want you to make a prediction. between a person who's going to be happier after 1 year. The person who won $314 million in the lottery, or a person who became a paraplegic? Who do you think is going to be happier? Now you're saying, well, because he's asking this question, I'm going to assume the paraplegic, right? But here's the fact. The fact of the matter is that after a year of research, they actually are equally happy. If you lost the use of your legs, a year later, the person who won the lottery, at the same time you lost the use of your legs, a year later, you guys actually have the same level of happiness. And you know, this is what we call impact bias. We have a certain bias where in our prefrontal cortex of our brain is what we call experience simulation. This is how we look at something and say, why does Ben and Jerry's not sit down and say, hey, why don't we have a liver, and codfish and onion flavor ice cream? Why do you think Ben and Jerry's doesn't have that flavor? It's not because they went in the laboratory, stirred it up, made some ice cream and tasted it and said, oh, this is nasty. That's why we don't have that flavor. No, it's because in your brain, in your prefrontal cortex, you can actually predict that, hey, this is not going to taste good, right? It's like if you see somebody take some food, they take off the cap of the salt and just start pouring it on, you'd be like, that's not going to taste good. Not because you didn't taste it, because in your brain, you have something called an experience simulator. But the reality is, you also have an impact bias. And that impact bias is what makes you and I believe that the different outcomes from various choices are actually more different than they really are. See, when you look at the guy who won the lottery and you look at the guy who lost the use of his legs, your prediction tells you, man, the guy who won the lottery is going to be way happier in a year. But it's because we cannot accurately predict the results of two different outcomes. We have a particular bias. And what this is about the fact that there's a different kind of happiness that I want to conclude with tonight. You see, I want to use some examples first. There is a man named Jim Wilson. Jim Wilson used to be the chairman of the House of Representatives. At one point in time, he was the most powerful Democrat in America. He got disrupted by a man in the background, Newt Gingrich, because Newt had exposed the fact that Jim Wilson had made some shady deals on a book. Basically exposed his whole, his character and everything. He lost his job, lost his power, lost his money. And you know what? After this happened, this is what Jim Wilson said. I am so much better off physically, financially, mentally, and in almost every other way. How could a person say that? You went from so here's the key to happiness, right? Become one of the most powerful people in the world and then lose it all. Then you'll be very happy. That's not what Jim Wilson is saying. But it does suggest something to us about why he could say this. Another person named is Maurice Bickham. You wouldn't know him. Maurice Bickham was actually locked up in the Louisiana State Penitentiary for 37 years for a crime that he never committed. He got out half of his sentence at 78 years old because of good behavior. When he came out of prison, they interviewed him and they said, Maurice, what do you think? And he said, I don't have 1 minute's regret. It was a glorious experience. He didn't say the penitentiary built a nice gym. Hey, I got to meet some pretty good guys in there. He didn't say I learned a lot about my appreciation for freedom. He said it was a glorious experience. I mean, the word glorious, you don't really use that word unless it's like a religious context. No one comes in and says, oh man, that sociology lecture, it was glorious. Like, no one describes things that way. Let alone the Louisiana State Penitentiary for 37 years. But the man said, I don't have 1 minute's regret. It was a glorious experience. Another individual in 1949, this guy, he's an interesting fellow. His name is Harry S. Langerman. He went and he met two guys who had a burger stand named McDonald's. They were selling burgers and he said, hey, this is a great idea. So he went to his brother in New York who was an investment banker and he said, hey man, can you lend me $3,000 so that I can go buy this burger stand? They said they'll sell it to me for a franchise. His brother said, you idiot, nobody eats hamburgers. That's what his brother told him. Did not give him the money. Well, Ray Kroc had the same idea, went and bought that thing and became the richest man of America not too long after that. And when he realized that he had a chance to buy the McDonald's franchise And his brother would not give him the money, $3,000 at the time, to do it because he said nobody eats burgers. Obviously, he was wrong, right? You think you'd be slapping your brother up inside, the house after you find out that you were wrong. But this is what Harry Langerman said. He said, I believe it turned out for the best. Hold on. You could have been the owner of McDonald's, and you're saying, I believe it turned out for the best. You're going to have to break that one down for me. Let me go to one other example. The Beatles, before they had Ringo as a drummer, they had a guy named Pete Best. Now, Pete Best was their drummer, and one time the Beatles were going into North America, and they left Pete somewhere, ended up picking up Ringo as their drummer, and never even told him that they replaced him. So now when you look at the Beatles, you're like, oh, Ringo is one of the original. Actually, he's not. Pete Best was the original. They literally dropped the guy, never even told him that they dropped him. And of course, we know where the Beatles went. I mean, they made history. And yet, this is what he said afterwards. He says, I'm happier than I would have been with the Beatles. Okay. Are you saying that because they were not kind to you? Are you saying that because, you're like, I didn't really need the money because my dad was actually a really wealthy investor. Warren Buffett is my uncle. Why would you be happier than you would have been if you were with the Beatles? The reason is this. It's something called synthetic happiness. This is the type of happiness we have when we don't get what we want. Each of these individuals had gone through, some of them traumatic, some of them very embarrassing and shameful experiences, and yet they could look back and see that they're happier because of the circumstance. It's not because the situation was not painful. It's not because it was not shameful. It's not because it didn't hurt. But because happiness is something that can actually be synthesized inside of the human mind. We can actually look back at the circumstances and we can literally create happiness and say, you know what? This is actually better. And this potential for us to create this kind of happiness is a way for us to recognize that most of the time in life, we are not going to get what we want. We're not always going to get the girl that we want. We're not always going to get the guy that we want. We're not always going to get the position that we want. We're not always going to get the internship or the promotion that we want. We're not always going to get the opportunity that we want. But you're telling me then, does that mean happiness is not possible? After you did all the flows, after you've done your pro-social spending, after you decided that I'm going to build my community and have strong relationships, you can still be happy? The answer is absolutely yes. And this is simply summarized in this particular verse in the letter to the Romans by the Apostle Paul. He says, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to His purpose. He was writing to a church that had been suffering persecution. He was writing to a group of Christians who had been multiple times having to meet in secret, because if they were found to be practicing the religion of Christianity, they would either be taken to the Colosseum or they'd be taken to a river, stripped of all their clothes in the dead of winter until they decided to bow down to Caesar. And he wrote the words to them, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God. This particular biblical teaching is already hinting at what modern day research has just caught up to. Happiness is not just about having an easy life, but it is about the fact that there is natural happiness, but there's also a synthetic kind. And so my challenge to all of us is not to leave this presentation thinking that happiness is about having an easy life and removing all the obstacles. Maurice Bickham was in prison for something he didn't even do for 37 years, but he could still be happy. We have the same potential. We have the same psychological equipment, a psychological immune system built inside of each and every one of us that God has given to help us, that even when we don't get what we want, we can still find joy, we can still find satisfaction. Thank you for your time. I want to invite each of you, if you got you should have gotten a response card when you came in. If you did not, I think they should have some to pass out. Do we have the response cards? Yes? Okay, if you don't have a response card, you can just raise your hand. They'll hand one out to you. I just want to get your feedback. David, I think you're going to be raffling off the iPad mini now. Okay, you could probably just hand it over to me. I think I'll be very happy,